Hello, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 6, the muscular system. This is a very intense chapter, so we're going to get right into it. When you think of the muscular system, most people think of skeletal muscle. There are three types of muscles associated with the body. These are skeletal muscle, which is what we focus on mainly in this chapter, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. So the muscular system is the skeletal muscle associated with our body, but we always like to talk about the other two types of muscles as well. And then this figure came from my OpenStax textbook. And you're just seeing an athlete who is running the field, playing tennis. You can see his skeletal muscle is allowing him to move. So a major function of all muscle is movement. So let's look at some comparisons between skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. In skeletal muscle, we have three connective tissue wrappings that surround the muscle itself. We have endomysium, which surrounds each individual muscle fiber, paramysium, which surrounds a fascicle of muscle fibers, and the epimysium surrounds the entire muscle. In cardiac and smooth, we only have the endomysium, which separates the muscles so that you can have contraction of individual cells versus the entire muscle all the time. When you look at the muscles close up, cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle are striated. So this is skeletal muscle. It's very striated. It has lots of stripes. Same with cardiac muscle. These striations occur due to the myofilaments that are found within the muscle fiber and how they run. They run in a specific direction all the time, and that produces those striations. Smooth muscle has some of the same myofilaments, but they don't run in the same direction, so it doesn't have that linear or that striated look. Skeletal muscle is multinucleate all the time. You can see multiple nuclei. The cells themselves are very long, elongate. Cardiac muscle is uni or binucleate. Typically, we think of them as uninucleate, but they can be binucleate. They are branched in structure, and so you can see the spaces in between where you have these branches. And they have intercalated discs, these darker spots here. You can see one there, you can see one there. These intercalated discs are where we have different types of junctions, desmosomes and gap junctions. And then smooth muscle is smooth in appearance. It has a fusiform structure, so I always think of this as like a cat's eye with a nucleus right in the middle, or I guess the iris would be right in the middle, because they have a kind of a cat's eye shape. The contraction of skeletal muscle can be very quick, but it also can be slow depending on what we need. Whereas cardiac muscle and smooth muscle, it tends to be much slower. The contraction starts slower and it takes longer to stop in both cases. Regulation of skeletal muscle is always via the nervous system, whereas cardiac has regulators of the nervous system and hormones, but it does have a pacemaker that allows it to contract without any nervous innervation or hormones. And then smooth muscle also contracts using nervous control or hormones. Skeletal muscle is called voluntary muscle because we control it. We can actually decide if we're going to move our muscles or not, whereas cardiac and smooth we have no control over, so those are involuntary muscles. So let's look at each muscle type a little bit more closely, and then we'll focus mainly on that skeletal muscle like I had said before. So skeletal muscle is muscle that is attached to our bones by connective tissue called tendons. So do you remember what tendons are composed of? I think I'm going to ask that in class at some time. So I'm not going to tell you now, but that might be something you want to look back up from chapter, what is it? 4 or 3. It might have been chapter 3. And then skeletal muscles are very large. They're long cylinders. They're multinucleate. They're striated, and they are voluntary, which we had already covered. They have those 3 connective tissue wrappings. I'm going to go to the next slide to show you what those look like. So surrounding each muscle fiber itself is an endomysium. This keeps each muscle fiber separated from the other muscle fibers, allows one muscle fiber to contract all on its own if it wants to. Surrounding a group or a bunch of muscle fibers is a paramecium. So this group of muscle fibers would be called a fascicle of fibers. And then surrounding the entire muscle would be the epimysium. The epimysium runs in to other connective tissue, forming that tendon. So a tendon is a cord-like structure, and some tendons or some connective tissue attachments are sheet-like structures called aponeuroses. They're the same material, same function, but they just are flattened tendons, basically. We can find tendons attaching most of our large muscles to our bones. Think of your arm, the biceps muscle, that large bulgy muscle on the anterior aspect of your brachial region is attached by a tendon to the radius. An example of an aponeurosis, a sheet-like tendon, attaches the muscle that covers the frontalis region of the head to the occipital region of the head. And there's a muscle there called the frontalis, and then there's a muscle on the back side called the occipitalis. They're attached to each other by this aponeurosis. Smooth muscle has no striations, and it is under involuntary control. So we do not control smooth muscle. We find smooth muscle around most of our, or in the walls of our hollow organs, like our blood vessels, our bronchi, our stomach, our esophagus. We have these smooth muscles that control movement of materials. We've already talked a little bit about smooth muscle because we talked about smooth muscle in the integumentary system in our last chapter when we looked at the erector pili muscles. Excuse me, sorry. And then cardiac muscle is striated, just like skeletal muscle. It's involuntary, just like smooth muscle. And we only find it in one region, and that's in the walls of the heart. It is considered uninucleate, but it can be binucleate. So I always say uni or binucleate. The cells are branched, and they are attached to each other at regions called intercalated discs, which contain the gap and the desmosomes. Gap junctions are those junctions that allow for communication from one cell to another, while desmosomes hold cells together and decrease mechanical stress on those cells. Cardiac muscle has its own pacemaker set right in. The pacemaker is known as the sinoatrial node, and it's found in the right atrium of the heart. And so here you can see cardiac muscle. So we're going to focus mainly on skeletal muscle, like I said, but all muscle functions in producing movement of the body or movement of materials throughout the body. Skeletal muscle has other functions that are very important as well, though. Stabilizing joints. So you've all heard of your rotator cuff. The rotator cuff actually is produced by multiple muscles that surround your shoulder joint and stabilize that shoulder joint. Skeletal muscle has to help in maintaining posture and body position, so we can sit and keep our back erect, or stand with our back erect without falling and stuff. And then skeletal muscle also functions in generation of heat. So anytime we move our body, we produce heat as a byproduct, which then functions in thermal regulation of the body. So if we get closer, if we look at the skeletal muscle on a microscopic level, we have structures called sarcolemma that surround each skeletal muscle fiber, and that's known as the plasma membrane of the muscle fiber. The myofibrils are the little structures inside of the muscle that contain or that hold all of the myofilaments within them. And myofilaments are the protein filaments that actually cause muscle contractions. So here's a myofibril within a single muscle fiber. So you can see multiple myofibrils found within one muscle fiber. And each myofibril has these segments that separate one region to the next region of the myofibril within that muscle fiber. And so we have areas called that are dark and other areas that are light. The dark area is known as the A band, and the light area is known as the I band, and that's what helps in producing those striations. So if we get even closer to, if we go in closer to that myofibril, you'll actually see different regions of the myofibril. So I'm going to move it to this slide. This slide gives you some information that you can read, but I'm going to go here and show you closer up. So here's that I band, that light band, and here's that A band, that dark band. Within the I band, we have a Z disc. The Z disc is the region that that designates the beginning and the end of one single sarcomere. The sarcomere is the functional unit of a muscle fiber. So from one Z disc to another Z disc is one full sarcomere. And so within that Z disc, we have that light band on each side. And then we have the dark band. The dark band, the A band, has in it an H zone. Okay. The H zone is going to be the darkest region because it only has dark or the thick filaments. The A band itself has both thick and thin filaments, which we'll talk about. And then the I band only has thin filaments. So I just mentioned the sarcomere is the contractile unit of a muscle fiber, and it runs from one Z band to the other Z band. Okay. The thick and thin filaments are what actually produce those different colorations and those striations then. Thick filaments are mainly those myosin proteins. Myosin proteins are contractile proteins. So they are the proteins, or one of the two proteins, that enter into a contraction that causes muscles to move. So it has a banding spot for ATP and a bonding spot, good Lord, I can't say the word, a binding spot for ATP, as well as the binding spot for actin. Thin filaments then, the main one that we talk about is actin. Actin is another contractile protein, and it has a region where myosin can bind. So myosin can reach up and bind to the myosin binding spot on actin. And when it does, it can cause, then the two can cause a contraction of the muscle fiber. So here you can see a very close up of a sarcomere. Here is the thick myosin filament. It's much thicker than the actin. You can see that. And there's the thin actin filament. So over here in the I band, we have only actin. Over here in the M line, we have only myosin. But when we look at the entire A band, from here all the way to here, we have both actin and myosin that are overlapping each other. And myosin has these little heads. These heads can reach up and bind onto the actin molecule when they are activated. There we go. Within a muscle fiber, attached to the sarcolemma is a specialized smooth endoplasmic reticulum called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This sarcoplasmic reticulum actually stores and releases calcium when stimulated. And we need calcium for muscle contractions. And so I'm going to stop here because it's at 16 minutes. And so we'll get into functions of skeletal muscle and then how the muscle contraction actually occurs in our next video. So I will see you or talk to you shortly. Bye.